Hola.
Hola. Hi, Ira. How are you?
Okay.
Okay. Nice to meet you.
You're all welcome. Could I ask please to mute yourself before we start? Thank you very much. So, dear audience, welcome to Simania Salon Readings, a platform I coordinate as part of the activities organized by the Association of Latin American Jewish Studies, LAJSA, which I warmly invite you to join. I am Cynthia Gabbay, a researcher and writer currently working at Humboldt University in Berlin, and my research is funded by the German Research Foundation. Today, we gather for the presentation of the volume Promised Lands, North and South, Jewish Canada and Jewish Argentina in Conversation, a volume co-edited by David Koffman and David Sheinin. This book is the 15th volume in the Jewish Latin American series, regularly published by Brill. Simania, which means bookmark in Hebrew, was created to provide a space for discussing books related to Latin American Jewish studies, whether new releases or long-standing works of interest to the field. I would like to renew this invitation, whether you are an author or a curious reader, if you believe that, for example, it is important to discuss together the modernist poetry of Abraham Zacarias López Peña, the philosophical essays of Leon Rosichner, or the novel El Rumor del Astracán by Azriel Bibliovich, LAJSA offers a space for engaging in dialogue about works of shared interest. Simania's meetings encourage the multilingual debate that is characteristic of Jewish cultures. While the official languages of LAJSA are Spanish, Portuguese, and English, we are open to incorporating other languages into Simania. Let's make this space a warm place, not only for debate, but also for the exchange of enthusiasm. I will profit this moment to announce our next meeting that will take place next month on October 9, and we will present the volume Diaspora and Law, Culture, Religion, and Jurisprudence Beyond Sovereignty, edited by Liliana Ruth Feierstein and Daniel Weidner. With that said, I will now introduce today's participants. David Koffman is the Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry and an associate professor in the Department of History at York University. He serves as the editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, Études Juives Canadiennes, and the associate director of York's Kozycki Center for Jewish Studies. He is the author of The Jews, Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, published in 2019. He's also the editor and a contributor to No Better Home, Jews, Canada, and the Sense of Belonging in 2021, and co-editor and contributor to Promised Lands, North and South, Jewish Canada and Jewish Argentina in Conversation from 2024. David Sheinin, co-editor of the same volume, is professor of history at Trent University and académico correspondiente of the Academia Nacional de la Historia de la República Argentina. In 2015, he published Sports Culture in Latin American History. In 2017, he published the volume Making Citizens in Argentina, and in 2021, Race and Transnationalism in the Americas. Both volumes were co-edited with Benjamin Bryce. His most recent book, co-edited with Nathan Hatton, is The Statues and Legacies of Combat Athletes in the Americas. Maggie Carlton is the Shelby Cullom Davis Center postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University. Her upcoming monograph, Mothering the Race, Racial Uplift and Motherhood in Interworld Detroit, focuses on the use of social work in Detroit to protect public daughters as well as transform the city's perception of Jewish and Black families. In addition, her work explores the idealization of the northern United States as the promised lands for Jewish immigrants and Southern migrants alike in the early 20th century. Regarding our presentation today of the volume Promised Lands, North and South, Jewish Canada and Jewish Argentina in Conversation, this is a conversational volume in which I had the honor to collaborate with my colleague Emily Robbins Sharpe with a chapter analyzing the influence of the Spanish poet Federico García Lorca in the Argentinian and Canadian cultural milieus. The volume is multidisciplinary and it brings a wide range of studies in sociology, migration, literary and cultural studies, historical perspectives on Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, but also on topics related to sport, television, and Yiddish theater. Let's now please hear the editors and our special guest who will discuss many of these topics. We will have time for discussion after the presentations. Please, Maggie, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone's attendance, and thank you again for allowing me to moderate this conversation. I have the pleasure of kind of reiterating some of what was said before, but I wanted to borrow the editor's words to introduce the book. Promised Lands, North and South is not a work of comparative sociology or political science. It does not offer a centrally coordinated set of direct comparisons. Rather, the book aims to put the two jewelry's experiences into conversation with one another in a kaleidoscope or cubist manner, taking suggestive but not exhaustive multi-perspective dimensions of each jewelry's experience and casting it through the reflective lens of one another. As stated in the book, American Jewish history has long been dominated by the United States, and this book seeks to decenter the United States and expand the field's borders to include Canada and South America, more specifically, Argentina. The book is broken up into 4 parts: making people, creating community, pitting culture, and dealing with difficulties. Now, I do want to open the floor for those who, the other contributors who would like to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'll be happy to say a couple of words, if that's okay. So my name is Arnan Rain. I'm also a contributor to this volume, but I'm also the editor of this book series, Jewish Latin America, published by Brill. So I'm extremely happy and extremely proud to have this volume in our series. I think it's an enormous contribution to both North American Jewish studies and Latin American Jewish studies. So I would like to thank very much both editors, David and David, and all contributors to this volume.
How about Marissa? Maybe I know who's the contributors, so or go ahead, Amy, you go next.
Well, I was going to say, since nobody else seems to want to do this, I'm Amy Kaminsky, and I'm retired from the University of Minnesota's Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies. And when the Davids approached me, I said, I'm retired, I don't do this anymore. So this is going to be very personal. I fell in love with both of them. I have not met them before, and I thought, well, okay. And this gave me a chance really to look into some of the things that I've had been doing toward the end of my career. I didn't have a background in Jewish studies, didn't have much of a Jewish education, apart from the, run-of-the-mill reform stuff as a kid. So I've always felt sort of like, I don't know, like a trespasser in this territory. And David and David just made me feel very welcome. And I had an enormously good time writing my piece, which is about the way the idea of the Jewish gaucho both brings Jews into and sets Jews apart from Argentinian culture. And I did it through literature. So when people say things, Maggie, like, this is not sociology, this is not history, this is not political science, it sure as heck isn't with my work. But I'm really delighted to have been part of this project. The other pieces are extraordinary. And I had never really thought about Canada much before, and now I do. So there you have it.
Ira?
Okay, so I have a couple of things to say, one of which is that I think I am part of the only father-son pair of contributors of separate articles to this volume. And so I want to thank Yosef for his contribution. And the second thing I will say is that when the Davids came to me, they came to me with a shidduch. Because, obviously, I wrote a book about anti-Semitism in Canada, so I know a little bit about Canada. But, I knew only general things about Argentina. So they made a shidduch for me with Marissa. And like, and they are great shadchanim because the relationship with me and Marissa worked out splendidly. And I think that our article is more than the sum of its parts. It's a way of understanding who Canadian Jews are and how they're situated, how Jews in Argentina are, who they are and how they're situated, viewed through their official reportage of anti-Semitic incidents. And I also want to say that, the work that Marissa and I did together is also informing my just finished contribution to the Cambridge History of Anti-Semitism, where I'm contributing a chapter. So I want to thank everybody concerned for that part of it as well. These things have ripple effects for me, and I'm sure for everybody else. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm obviously Ira's son, and so actually this is the first time ever that I've contributed even an article written just by myself, a published article written just by myself, as opposed to with my father, like in the past, and with other subjects. And yeah, no, I profusely thank the two Davids and everybody else for giving me the space to write my chapter. And this chapter is just one prong among many in trying to diffuse as widely as possible the sort of alternate history or counterfactual history of what could have happened differently and much for the better in Argentina and that part of South America. And so this one obviously is mainly about the Jews, but I want to widen the discussion to the general public. And while this is an academic book, I think that this is a step in the right direction.
Marissa, last but not least.
Thank you very much. Well, I apologize because of my English. Okay, well, really, thank you very much for thinking in me and all my experience about anti-Semitism in Argentina. For the last 25 years, we've been doing our reports, and I agree with Ira. We work together in a beautiful way. And of course, I got in touch with Canadian Jewish community. It was very interesting for me. There were a lot of things I ignored, but at the same time, we found a lot of things we have similar. So, well, this means that the Jewish people is one people all around the world. And I want to say that during the process of writing this article with Ira, we suffered the 7th of October attack there in Israel, and it was really very important for me to share some conversations with him in some different Zooms we share. And well, I find this kind of work very interesting because it added a complexity to my idea of anti-Semitism in general and the new struggles we have to in front of us since now, and I imagine and I believe that forever. So thank you very much.
Maggie, do you mind if I throw in some appreciations as well?
Oh, no, you're fine. So I want both you and Dr. Sheinin to speak as well.
So, well, first of all, Maggie, I wanted just to thank you for facilitating, and thank you, Cynthia, for organizing. And I also wanted to thank David, the co-editor, just for asking me to join this venture in the first place. David, and for being so smart and so professional from start to finish with this project. Renan, I want to thank you too for putting David up to this task in the first place and for publishing the final volume in the series. Please extend our thanks to the team at Brill, the editorial staff, the professional promotional staff too, and to all of the really amazing hardworking contributors for this volume, including those who are not in attendance. And I also wanted to thank that the Latin American Jewish Studies Association, not just for doing this and for some of you coming out today, but for really engaging in a fruitful dialogue with the Canadianists, which is now like a 3 or 4 year long conversation. I think we held joint sessions at both the Association for Canadian Jewish Studies and the Latin American Jewish Studies Association, sort of co-facilitated or panels, comparative panels during the pandemic. One was just among historians, and one were scholars from a variety of other disciplines, from literature, sociology, and I don't remember, I think mostly literature and sociology folks. And this book just kind of grew out of those conference sessions. And I think there's more to do and more, fruitful collaboration. So those are my thanks. I guess I would share that my chapter is also a co-authored contribution with Stephanie Bates, or Stephanie Pridgeon, from Bates, who said she couldn't be here today, but wished she could. And it's a study of Jewish writers from the turn of the 19th century to more or less the present in both countries, who have grappled with themes about colonialism and indigeneity and indigenous characters, and a kind of longitudinal literary study about how those two different Jewish literary communities in each countries have how their treatments have changed over time, and where they were parallel, and where and why and how they diverged in the more recent decades. Thanks.
So I'd also like to begin with some thank yous. Maggie, thank you very much for doing this. It's a treat to have you here, and thank you for diving into two different national subjects that you're normally used to. You're not normally used to working with. So it's a treat to have you here. I am very happy and grateful to Hanan Rein for his support in all sorts of ways of this project, including, and I hope it's okay to say, financial support from his chair at, meaning his endowed chairship at Tel Aviv University. But more, it was the ideas and thoughts that I deeply appreciate, and I think we deeply appreciate. Moreover, I think most people here, maybe almost everybody's familiar with the Brill series that David mentioned. It is the definitive series on Latin American Jewish studies of this generation, and some of the contributors have written monographs and done other edited volumes in the series, and I encourage people to have a look if you haven't done that already. You know, one of the great treats of being at my stage in the profession is to occasionally work with a much smarter and younger colleague, much younger colleague. Sheinin I've worked with a lot, and he's much smarter. He's younger, but he's not much younger. I'm talking about David Koffman. And I think that not only was this a challenging project, thanks to him, but it's probably the most fun I had working on an edited volume. And I'm very grateful for that. The idea, there were about half of the chapters in the volume are by single authors, including mine, on two protagonists from the boxing world of each country, and Amy's chapter. It was David's idea to talk to everybody, including Amy, and we met with everybody. And it was a novelty for me to go in the direction of trying to bring people together and help them hammer out projects. I'm not sure they always needed our help, those who worked in pairs, but it was a real treat and a great adventure. And David, I thank you for that. It was tremendous fun. Is this a good moment to say a few more things? Can I go on briefly? Okay, I'm going to take that as a yes. I'm going to maybe launch into something about the volume. I'm not going to go into every chapter, and those who are here, whose chapter I'm not going to touch on briefly. I learned a great deal from every chapter. Every chapter opened all sorts of new doors and suggested all sorts of new avenues of investigation. I just want to cite a couple. So Cynthia's chapter with Emily, I think it's the chapter that probably demonstrates just how close Jewish transnational communities in the Americas were in their celebration of Lorca in this case, but in lots of other ways. Of course, there were important differences, and the chapter is very nuanced, but the parallels are so striking, bearing in mind that Lorca was in Argentina for a lengthy time, and in Canada, not at all. Hanan's chapter with Simon Lacasse, I think, is particularly informative. We know a lot about, thanks in part to Hanan and to others sitting here, about Jewish involvement in the political mainstream. In Argentina, we know a lot about Jewish involvement with the revolutionary left. There's a lot we don't know about Jewish links to the right in Argentina and in Canada. And there's a lot of room to think about that, I would argue. This is subversive talk for Argentina for many people, but there's lots of work to be done there, I would say. And I think that this chapter signals that. I'll mention one more chapter, and that's Mariusz Kalchewiak's chapter, thinking comparatively of two memoirs of Jewish immigrants to Canada and Argentina who came to agricultural colonies. And again, there's much I could say, but it pointed out just how, in comparison to Argentina, how significantly in popular culture those colonies have been forgotten in the Canadian case. In Argentina, they loom large in the national Jewish consciousness and beyond. And we are dying for a good comparative study, not only of those communities, those agricultural colonies, sometimes funded by the same sources at around the same times, but also the memory of those colonies and what happened to them. I will stop talking at this point, except to thank all of you. It's a treat to be with so many of the authors in the volume, and I thank each and every one of you. And I will stop talking right now.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves and David for talking about some of the chapters there. So I do want to reiterate that Brill's given 25% discount that David Koffman put in the chat. So if you would like to buy the book, it's good until the end of the year. For right now, I do want to start with a general question. And for me, as an Americanist, I was wondering about the influence of European anti-Semitism in Argentina and Canada, and how Canada and Argentina made it their own and kind of used it in different ways. If anyone wants to speak to that at all.
And I can add an extra layer to the question and maybe ask if it can be a kind of, where are there European threads and where are there American threads that influence these two other countries' articulations? Because there's two sources, but I'd certainly be interested in hearing some responses to that too.
Yes, and if I want to be more specific, I really enjoyed Amy's chapter on the Jewish gaucho, and I just could not remove the image of the new Hebrew man that comes in with the creation of like the Sabra in Israel, and so it made me question how the feminized trope of Jewish men could be successfully, I doubt if it was fully successful to replace was replacing these two societies as we thought of as Jewish men were derogatorily addressed as feminized men in Europe.
It's a big question. And it's not within my realm of expertise. So I'm just going to float some thoughts that other people can pick up. But I think that one thread of one of the places for, or from which Argentinian anti-Semitism derives is clearly the teachings of the Catholic Church, which for many, many years trafficked in anti-Semitic discourse and tropes. The sense, I'm not sure what kind of indigenous anti-Semitism there might have been, but I think that any immigrant culture that brings in many different people from many different parts of the world has the opportunity to bring in different anti-Semitisms from, say, various parts of Europe, and the way that those have been disseminated in the rest of the world through whatever, channels they might have, they might have found themselves in. So that it's, I think that there's a kind of reprocessing that goes on, but I don't know that you can, the idea of an indigenous anti-Semitism that comes, say, from Native peoples doesn't compute at all for me. So I think I'll just leave that there, because I'll just start rambling if I don't.
Well, I can add not only Catholic Church, but also some Nazis ideas. Those who arrived to Argentina, a lot of war criminals arrived to Argentina. And you can find, not today, but it used to be a very anti-Semitic, all the areas of the military, army, and policemen. And during the last dictatorship, there was a terrible anti-Semitic dimension. There are lots of Jewish disappeared people up to date, missing people, who received a terrible treatment, not only because they were thought to be communist, but also because they belong to the Jewish community. this I can say from European ideas. Today, the problem is quite different, and it comes also from leftist groups. And today, the main topic and issue is Israel, of course.
Ira, did you want to jump in with some thoughts about this?
No, I think Marissa expressed it very well.
Well, I would just add that I think there's some important threads that come at least to Canada. I'm not sure about Argentina from the United States, where at least in the, say, the first half of the 20th century, anti-immigration anxiety, nativism, xenophobia, kind of the trouble with a de facto pluralistic multicultural society, as well as the, lightning industrialization, generates a lot of anxiety, some of which is pegged onto the Jews. I don't see this as a European import per se, but more of a, something that the Canada and the United States shares. I'd also add that I hadn't really thought about this before, but I think the Jews come to both Canada and Argentina in the first place, not as a kind of invited merchant minority, as the long history of Jews in Europe had the arrival of Jews in the first place, where it was basically a specific introduction of a kind of foreign ethno-national religion or ethno-religious community in order to, advance a certain set of interests, which is why the expulsions and the invitations kind of went hand in hand for 1,000 years. But the arrival of Jews both in Canada and Argentina and the United States, of course, was not in any way based on these, philo-Semitic tropes or any kind of estimation of political officials that inviting Jews in particular would somehow advance the economic well-being of the state. Rather, they were just open policies as, multicultural, general Europeanists. So Jews didn't come really as Jews in a sense from the state's perspective. So the possibility of there being a kind of expulsion at the end of the, utility of the Jews, or when the status quo got rocked and there was one particular minority that could be blamed for the social ills, that would have never and could have never happened on the count of the vast diversity of immigrants who came to the United States and to Canada, and I think to Argentina as well, if that argument holds.
I think that there's a slight codicil to that. When Argentina was developing itself as a modern nation, there was a deliberate attempt to bring Europeans to Argentina.
But not Jews per se.
But eventually Jews.
Same thing with Canada as Europeans, but not qua Jews.
Right, exactly. And it wasn't until Argentina really kind of went through everybody else that they pretty much scraped the bottom of the barrels with Southern Italians and Jews who were being invited. They were being invited at the same time, but it was really, we're looking for people who might be white. We're not sure about this yet, but that's how I'm reading it. But it didn't happen until the very end of this program to Europeanize Argentina. So it's an interesting, it's an interesting place for Jews to be. It's both being invited as Europeans, but not the right kind of Europeans, really.
Yes, also, in Canada as well, the Canadians really wanted immigrants from the British Isles. That was, well into the 20th century, that was still their ideal. How can we attract people from the British Isles? And it is only upon realizing that Canada has lots of space that needs to be populated, and there are not enough British immigrants coming in, that they reluctantly opened up to European, not, decidedly not Asian immigration, but European immigration, and Jews came in.
Kind of in relation to this topic, I wondered about how minorities in these or indigenous people also perceive Jewishness. Do they perceive it as white or white adjacent? And what's their relationship? And I want to reference this because I focus on the relationship between Black Southern migrants and Jewish immigrants in Detroit. So the view of Jews in Detroit is that they're not white, so they refer to them as Hebrew, but there is an understanding that they're white adjacent and viewed as kind of oppressors. So there is a sort of anti-Semitism that arises in the Black community that differs from the wider white society. I was wondering if that happens at all in Canada or in Argentina.
I heard something in your question about indigenous people. Are you asking specifically if indigenous peoples in Argentina or Canada, how they perceive the Jews?
Yes, just in the conversation about the agricultural colonies and the giving of land to Jews at that time. I know that it wasn't as successful in Canada as it was in Argentina, but I wanted to know how the indigenous view them in the long run, even today, when thinking about Jewishness in these nations.
Well, maybe I'll have a go at that. It's a super interesting question. So I've been thinking about relationships between Jews and indigenous people in Canada, the United States, for some time. And it's, it's less of a dialogue, less of a story of dialogue, at least in my ability to tell it, than how do indigenous people appear for Jews and Jewish culture and Jewish history and Jewish politics. I wish it could be more of dialogue. I'm just not equipped as a researcher to do the kind of the other side of the conversation. But I have been part of these conversations for, as I say, quite some time, and I've gotten a little bit of a drift of it. I think one thing to say on a scholarly front is that unfortunately there is no research out there about indigenous perceptions of Jews. And I think it'd be very valuable. And there's many Native American and First Nations intellectuals who have spoken to, who concur that it would be a very valuable study, in part in order to understand how different indigenous nations began incorporating non-indigenous language for non-indigenous people, or even for people that were not part of their own nation. So the development of language, there is certainly very, very early language for people who are part of another people, not the people, not the Dene or whoever, but other indigenous people with whom they had trade relations or warring traditions or whatnot. But when and how is the language of national origins adopted, by whom, how is that incorporated? How do you make sense of all these sort of different people that are part of the settler, the settler onslaught? And what I think is fair to say is that in general, the indigenous people are making distinctions between those who are rapacious as far as land grabs go, and those who are not, those who are missionizing and those who are not, and those who are fair in business dealings and those who are not. So in 19th century, I've certainly found a handful of sources where indigenous people are identifying Jews as Jews. Sometimes they're called egg eaters. These are sort of identifying the peddlers who are, trafficking in rural and interscene spaces along the so-called frontier and are engaging in sort of petty trade relationships with Jews. And they understand that these peddlers have a different kind of relationship, or are different insofar as they won't partake in their meat and all the rest of them. So they don't really care that they're Jews per se, but they're going to make their decisions about with whom to trade, who is a trustworthy person to extend credit to or whatnot, based on these sort of trade relationships. I think the idea of the Jew as something that's somehow different from other settlers has two parts. One, that when they do encounter Jews, they aren't missionized to, as opposed to lots of the other, European settlers, the other white settlers, some of whom are very interested in indigenous people, specifically on account of their interest in missionizing. And the other is that they begin to internalize ideas about Jews through their interactions with those very same Christian missionaries who are introducing the idea of the Jew before indigenous people actually meet any of them. So there's like a 300-year conversation that's afoot from the early mid-17th century that sort of finally trails off at the end of the 20th about Native Americans, even South American natives, being descended from or somehow connected to the lost tribes of Israel. And this is a conversation that reaches into Native communities themselves, insofar as they're missionized and they actually take on that identity. Yes, we are a biblical people too. We are lost tribes. Or insofar as they refuse that and say that has nothing to do with it. But in this nexus where Jews and indigenous people are meant to share some kind of identity based on the fantasies of missionaries and travelers and captivity narrators, then indigenous people are kind of forced to think about who the Jews are and who their relationships are with them. So it's totally fascinating. There's only a little bit of research on this, and I think it deserves more. As just to bring it up to date, up to the present, I think in the post 40s 50s era, Jews obviously appear to indigenous people as a white adjacent or off-white, but nonetheless colonizing peoples. And starting in the 90s and certainly continuing pretty intensely into the present, when the question of Zionism and indigeneity and Israel and who allies should back in the supposedly, pick your sides battle of Israel-Palestine, then the Jewish kind of question enters into the indigenous intellectual and journalistic landscape more intensely, and for the most part, sort of sides with Palestinians in the claim that that Jews are colonizers, there as well. Although there's definitely a strong minority voice within the indigenous world as well that flips the script, that says, no, we recognize that the Jews have an indigenous claim to the land of Israel, or indigenous leaders who say, no, there's two people who have indigenous claims here, and we don't like the non-indigenous people using the language of settler colonialism, with reference to Israel at all. Leave our language and our struggle out of that conflict. So it's a messy and a diverse set of voices in this contemporary moment, but I think the lion's share is still a sense of allyship with Palestinians.
I am looking at the time. I want to open up the floor for others to ask any questions. Is there anyone who would like to ask a certain question about this book?
I don't mean to out anyone or put anyone on the spot, but we have 3 people who are not contributors to or involved in the webinar launch themselves, and just have an extra welcome to you. And if you have questions or want to make comments, we're just in a meeting at this point and not a big launch.
Yeah, I have one quick question, and then I apologize, I have to run to another meeting, but what are the topics that you left outside? What were the topics that you wanted to deal with in this volume, but somehow because you weren't able to find contributors were left out?
Good question, David. Do you remember some? I can start thinking too.
Sure. Interactions with Israel, Orthodox communities, and perhaps other religious communities. Those in particular.
Yeah, I think we tried to find contributors who also might write on more gender issues. There was one submission that we were hoping to get on philanthropy and sort of public culture. I think there was an education chapter that we were hoping to include that we couldn't. I was hoping to get more on the Jewish right as well. But so many of these articles, I think, the ideas sort of came together during the pandemic, and part of the background thinking, I guess, was that if we put at least some people together, that they didn't need to be have access to new primary sources, if it was difficult to gather data, or for the historians difficult to get to the archives, but that they might find some new insights that could only be generated by working collaboratively. So as David said, half the chapters were collaborative in this sense and didn't require at least the historians to find material that they couldn't get access to. So there were a bunch. There could be another volume, or maybe a special issue of a journal or something like that, or a joint venture between the Latin American Jewish Studies Journal and Canadian Jewish Studies, with more topics. As just one plug, I edit the Canadian Jewish Studies Journal, and if there are folks that that you're in conversation with, who are interested in intersectional or comparative stuff, we would very much welcome and hope to be able to publish this kind of stuff in the journal in the future.
I would like to jump in. I have a comment, but just to show you the book that I think we forgot to show. I found your introduction very interesting, and I would like to ask you please to talk a little bit about this anti-comparative perspective, in the sense that you are, I think, rightly talking about a conversation and not a comparison. So if you could a little bit globally explain what are the difference between a comparison and a conversation.
David, you want to take this one?
Well, for starters, it allows some authors to write about a problem without thinking much about the other national context, or thinking about it and not necessarily including it in the article. So to give you one example, Ben Bryce's excellent chapter on the Jewish hospital in Buenos Aires was written with a great knowledge of Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto and other hospitals and clinics in the Americas, some that no longer exist. And even though Canada is never mentioned, that article is suggestive of all sorts of possibilities in thinking about the question of ethnicity as an avenue to national identity. So that's one way to look at it. Also, I think comparison forces people perhaps to think about the two national contexts in ways that might demand a sort of balance. We were looking for something much more open in terms of how people approach things. So I think conversation, which is David's word, is a great one here. The project started with conversations that David spearheaded and that we both did with authors. And really, we were asking people to do what they thought they wanted to do with the topic. And so demanding less rigidity, I think, is the big difference.
I'm eager to hear from Irina, but I just wanted to jump in and say that I think we were also very much open to comparison. It wasn't that we were explicitly anti-comparativist. I think had people pitched comparative projects, especially either historical ones, which are a little harder to do, but sociological ones, if we could have found more sociologists or people working in social sciences, I would have absolutely welcomed that. And I think that there's some value to be gained in what new questions are generated by explicit comparison. And then there may need to be follow-up to kind of explain how these are meaningful and what it might say about an even larger experience of Jewish modernity. And you might not be able to get at those larger Jewish modernities when you're just comparing, or even, I should say, just putting stuff into conversation with the uniqueness of the context of this place and the uniqueness of context of that place. So just to give one example, like the parallel numbers in terms of immigration are pretty fascinating, because by the end of the 1880s, there's just under 400,000 Jews that are roughly split between, that leave Eastern Europe, that go to Canada and Argentina. Obviously, there's many more that go to the United States and other places. And so by the early 20s, the Jewish populations in both countries are almost identical. There's about 125,000 Jews in both countries. In the 30s and 40s, Argentina's numbers grow at about twice as fast as Canada's. And then Canada kind of catches up in the 50s and 60s, such that they're basically identical again, by around 1970, with about twice as many people as there were 50 years earlier. And then fascinatingly, from the 1980s to the 2020s to the present, Argentina's numbers actively decline to maybe 165,000 people, while Canada's Jewish numbers actively grow. So you have these two very different population trajectories. And you can see some really stark differences with very close parallels, and then sharp divergences that sort of invite questions about, well, how does that work, and coming and going, all kinds of studies that might get generated by virtue of asking the comparison in the first place.
Thank you. Yeah, Nerina, you can talk. Spanish is good. I just remind everybody that you can use it.
Do you speak Spanish? Can I speak Spanish? Yes? Okay. So, congratulations, felicitaciones. Todavía no leí el libro, pero bueno, lo voy a hacer, me interesa muchísimo. Y bueno, quiero hacerle una pregunta a David Sheinin. A David Sheinin. Si entendí bien, en algún momento, David, dijiste que sabemos mucho de las relaciones entre las colectividades judías del mundo y las izquierdas, pero que sabemos muy poco sobre las relaciones de las colectividades judías y las derechas, ¿no? Y yo agregaría, además de las derechas, los grupos que están en el poder económico, en la política, digamos, en lugares que son inconvenientes para la imagen de una colectividad judía siempre minoritaria, digamos, en un lugar de víctima por su historia, sobre todo su historia reciente del siglo XX, ¿no? Entonces me pregunto si podrías ir un poco más o explorar más esa hipótesis de por qué nos faltan estudios, investigaciones sobre las relaciones de la colectividad judía con grupos políticamente incorrectos o inconvenientes. No sé si me explico.
Perfectamente. Muchas gracias, Nerina. Un placer verte nuevamente. Después de muchos años en Israel nos vimos la última vez.
Sí.
Una pregunta. ¿Puedo hablar en inglés o preferís en castellano?
No, en inglés.
Okay. So just very quickly, I hope I do it justice. Nerina's question was why? Why isn't there more work on what she terms these inconvenient relationships between Jews and the right? Probably, I know this because there are a lot of people who don't like what I'm going to say in Argentina, but I think that it is socially and culturally unacceptable to ask certain questions. I'll give you an example that you will know, but others might not. It has nothing to do specifically, but it's one I'm working on. There was a very important labor leader who was murdered in 1969 by left-wing revolutionaries in Argentina, Augusto Andor. And his story and his murder become very important in constructing a positive image of revolutionaries / terrorists who killed a labor leader. And the story is that he tried to transform the movement into something that he was the most prominent labor leader, where there was broad worker support, into something bureaucratic and authoritarian. Nobody has written a good biography, a political biography of Andor, to ask questions about, was there worker support? It's impossible to find that information. In the 1950s, yes, he was a very charismatic union leader, but it's like he went crazy and suddenly ignored the workers. I don't believe it. When the Jewish umbrella organization, Daya, supported the military government, I don't believe that they were acting without the support of some in the Jewish community. We don't have a good study of that. And to give one more very good example, you know, Graciela Mochkovsky has written an excellent biography of Jacobo Timerman, the most prominent voice, not just Jewish voice, the most prominent voice of opposition nationally and internationally against the dictatorship in the late 1970s and early 80s. I mean, he was in regular contact with the military. He and his son, Hector Timerman, who was also a newspaper editor at the time, supported the military takeover. They had extensive contacts with the US government. They were opponents of the revolutionary left that had bombed their home on at least 3 occasions, according to Hector in an interview he gave. We don't ask larger questions about the Jewish community. And I think the last thing I would say is that identities are multiple. Jews are Jews. They're also members of a middle class, many of whom supported the military takeover for a variety of reasons. They had other kinds of identities as well. It is socially and culturally unacceptable to say what I've just said and to ask questions about it. And I can give you an example of an excellent historian who was ostracized in Argentina for writing an excellent book on Sebastián Carasay on the middle classes, and the fact that middle classes, Jews and non-Jews, expressed a certain amount of support for the far right. I'm not justifying any of this. I'm simply saying that questions, it's very hard for those questions to be asked. Forget about winning support from a group like CONICET, the equivalent to SSHRC in Canada, or other groups to do that sort of research. If I can ask those questions and do some of the work, it's because I'm an outsider and I don't care if people don't like me for asking questions and expressing what I think.
I just add quickly that there's like a historiographic bias of maybe like a 500-to-1 ratio of writing about the Jewish left versus the Jewish right. My favorite,
yeah, except your estimate is far too low.
Right, 5,000 to 1.
Absolutely socially unacceptable. And you know, my work as an editor on this volume was not to pick fights with people, but I didn't agree with everything that was written. It was my job to help some of those who had different opinions that I did on such matters do the best job that they could and make their arguments effectively. And that's absolutely fair. I'm not saying I'm right. Those are the questions that I have.
I dropped in the chat one amazing study about the right, the Jewish right in Poland, by Dan Heller,
Right,
came out a few years ago. I think one of like a model history books about, you know, writing about the Jewish right. I hope that there's many more in Israel, about the United States. It would be fascinating to do a study on the Canadian Jewish right. It's certainly high time as historians.
Can I add something?
Yes, go ahead.
Can I speak in Spanish? For me, it's easier, or you prefer in English?
Yes.
In English.
Spanish is fine. Spanish is fine.
Spanish is fine. Que entiendo perfectamente la pregunta de Nerina, porque a primera vista sería una contradicción que que lo judío esté cerca de las derechas, porque las derechas por definición están en contra de la democracia y contra las minorías, con lo cual resulta muy difícil ese vínculo y yo creo que por eso hay pocas cosas escritas y evaluadas. De hecho, hoy en día la Argentina tiene un gobierno de derecha explícito y de un presidente que está muy cerca de la comunidad y que coquetea con determinados sectores de la comunidad judía. Y bueno, y es una experiencia, por lo menos lo digo a título personal, no institucional, es una experiencia muy extraña y muy difícil, que va a llevar, creo que un tiempo, poder tomar distancia y hacer un análisis serio de la situación. Pero entiendo que como primera medida es como una contradicción. Todos los totalitarismos y todas las derechas fueron más que nada antisemitas y también después fueron contra otros grupos.
Thank you so much, Narita, for that question. I was wondering some similar things because it happens in U.S. history as well. There has been some books coming out about the Jewish right in the U.S. and this was good to read about Argentina and the Jewish right there because it really does offer a more diverse view of Jewishness around the world, as Jewishness is always attached to the left. Are there any other additional comments anyone would like to make before we move on to Yosef's question? Okay, so Yosef, you can go ahead.
Okay, so well, before I get to my main question, I just want to give a quick comment. Well, actually, two quick comments. First of all, in the first real chapter that is about the Jewish immigration to Canada and to Argentina, well, for the early 20th century, they extensively discussed the Eastern European Jewish immigration to both Canada and to Argentina. There doesn't seem to be any discussion at all on Sephardic migration from Syria and from Greece and Turkey, as well as Morocco, to Canada, to Argentina, excuse me. I mean, there was none that sort to Canada, really, but there's no discussion in that chapter of such Sephardic migration to Argentina, when in fact it was sort of a significant force in its own right, even if it was greatly outnumbered by the Eastern European Jewish immigration to Argentina as well as to Canada. Okay, so that's comment one. Comment number two, and something I probably should have shown during my introduction. I'd like to show you very briefly a couple of maps of Argentina / the southern cone of South America in general, what it would be like in that counterfactual world that I've envisaged for 20 years, very, very quickly. That's my main question I had. Okay, so, yeah, I think you can see the maps of, because, a lot of things look similar, and yet the borders are, some of the borders are very different. So it looks, similar, and yet everything is different. Okay, yeah, so that's my second comment. Okay, so now my question, for which I want to comment in this time is, so how many, I'm wondering just, how many people who look at that book would read the conclusion as well as reading, who that my chapter is the conclusion. So how many people would read that versus some or many of the other preceding parts of the book?
I don't think we have data on the readership, but I suppose you could write to our editor at Brill and see if there are, numbers of downloads of specific chapters rather than the whole book.
I'll tell you an interesting one-off that you'll like, Joseph. I got a very nice email from one of my colleagues in the Argentine embassy saying that he liked the book, but he had a few concerns, he wrote with a little smiley face about the last chapter, yours. So it drew some attention from Argentine diplomats. But I want to underscore, this person said it with a sense of humor. He wasn't offended or bothered.
Okay, yeah, okay, cool.
Okay, so I don't know if you'd like to start to wrap this, and maybe David, you have more comments or other perspectives, or Maggie, of course.
I mean, I think we're covered. I'm happy that some people came out to hear this, and maybe some people will. I see it's being recorded, so I suppose you're going to put it up on the website. So if there's other people who are listening or listen later, feel free to reach out to any of the authors or to me or David if you have questions or want to engage. And if there's more scholarship to produce, that's most importantly, please keep an open mind to thinking about Latin American Jewish studies, not just Argentinian, but Latin America more broadly, and then the Canadianists, and let's hopefully keep the conversation going.
Thank you. Yes, I think I just talking personally from my experience with Emily Robbins Sharper, it was I think the first time I wrote really a whole article with someone, and it was a wonderful experience. Of course, I suppose it has to be that I knew Emily a little bit from before because she collaborates with a book I edited. But I think this is a great way of discovering new issues, even in your own research. So I would like to thank you for this opportunity. It was really, really interesting. And unless you have something more to say, we will close this for this time. And you will find tomorrow in LAJSA's YouTube's site, you will find the recording of this conversation. So thank you very much, David and Maggie and the public. See you next month, and keep safe, and have a Shana Tova also. Bye-bye.
I wanted to say just one thing.
Yeah,
I really appreciated being invited to this and receiving the book. It has definitely made me want to change how I would teach a modern Jewish history course, because we've always done Europe, emancipation, Zionism that kind of goes into the Zionist project in South America or off the coast of Africa. But incorporating literature from Argentina and Canada and the histories there, I think would make create a fuller picture of the Jewish diaspora that I think is missing in a lot of modern Jewish history courses that I've been part of and have sat in. So I want to thank you all for contributing. I especially enjoy Amy's article on the Jewish gaucho, because it just makes me think of how we view masculinity, Jewish masculinity, in a different way. So thank you again.
Thank you all.
Everybody.
Thank you. Nice to meet all of you and see all of those of you I already knew.